Chat's down on the bottom right-hand side. Type message here. Good, I see it. All right, and that's where you'll post questions too as we go along. So I have Mr. Mike Morgan here with me, and I've worked with Mike for many years in different capacities, so we'll ask him some questions and get started with him. I want to first see if you have any comments, concerns, questions about the class that I can think about while we're talking to Mike, so I can get anything answered that you need. What I wanted to tell you is that everything is going along pretty good for me for the class with 100 students in 2 different classes. You're starting to get into the mode of citing your work, and that's going rather well. So you're using OneSearch, the text, Marshall Project, or Police One. That's great. Those are all things that you would use for basic research. So that's going real good. I like what I'm seeing there. I wanted to remind you of something. See if I can find it. I don't see it here on the, let's see, modules. It's not showing up. Oh, here it is. Okay, I'm sharing my board with you. Remember that down here on, as you look now in CJ 100, they're called lessons, 1, 2, 3, 4 through 15. In CJ 270, they're called modules. I need to change those so they're both one or the other. But don't forget about this little arrow off here on the right. If you can see my mouse on this, you'll notice that I'm able to open up one of these modules. But the cool thing about that is you can click that little arrow and you can close that down. So if you close those modules down, then they're really easy to navigate. At the end of the semester, if you leave all of those open, to me, they resemble the dead scrolls. You're rolling through trying to find something and you just can't locate it because everything's open, every week's open, and I would be lost too. So don't forget about these little arrows here. It says show details on the very right hand of your screen, and it'll shut those modules down. You need to do that so you don't have to sweat that. All right, now I'm gonna somehow reopen. Okay, there we go. All right, I just wanted to let you know about that. Let's start with Mr. Mike. Mike, go ahead and tell us a little bit about, let's start back with your first law enforcement job.
My first law enforcement job, when I actually started out in the Air Force, I was what they call a law enforcement specialist. Now it's considered security forces, but as a law enforcement specialist, I graduated from that academy in July of 1982. I was then stationed in New Mexico, Kirtland Air Force Base, which is based in Albuquerque, New Mexico. I then went on and got on with the Bernalillo County Sheriff's Department. That's in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and then with the Albuquerque Police Department as a reserve officer. I then, after I left the military in 1988, I came back here to Cape Girardeau, Missouri, and got on with the Cape Girardeau Police Department. Worked there for 2 years, and then worked for 20 years at the Cape Girardeau County Sheriff's Department. I then left there in 2009, 2010. I then began to work for Dr. Rhodes as a detention aide. And then now I do a program called Detention Alternatives, where juveniles that may score to be housed in a detention juvenile facility. They are now kept at home under what we call home detention, which means they stay at home, or they have a ankle bracelet on, electronic monitor, or they're given a 7 p.m. curfew or whatever curfew that they're a deputy juvenile officer.
So your program now is a grant project.
It's a grant project, correct?
Now, I've written the proposal. It was to the state of Missouri, and I write it every year. We keep stats on the program, and it basically started as a grant through the Casey Foundation to try to cut down on the number of kids in detention. So those kids do score for detention, but they're given an alternative to be at home under these various rules and supervision. So you've worked with adults, well, you've worked with soldiers, you've worked with citizens as a police officer, so just the run-of-the-mill citizen.
Yes.
And then you've worked with, how many was the average population in that county jail?
About 225.
225. So we're not talking about a little 10-bed county jail, 225 inmates at a time, to now juveniles at home. What are the different strategies do you use, or do you just have to get out a notebook to figure out what you're going to do today?
A lot of these kids are no two kids are alike. Some kids you can talk with and, say, hey, you're doing really good. I'm glad you're at home. I'm glad you're abiding by rules. Some of them you have to play the stern uncle or the stern parent. Some kids, like today, we had a couple of kids that decide they're not going to abide by the guidelines, and now they're on an electronic monitor and they're stuck at home, whereas they were on a 7 p.m. curfew and they weren't abiding by the curfew. So the juvenile officer placed those two juveniles on an electronic monitor.
And that's called graduated sanctions. I am sure that the policy would have been 10 years ago with those two not very courteous young ladies. They would have been locked up. They'd have violated their agreement. They would have had the last straw on the camel's back of the deputy juvenile officer. She was in here 3 times today because the principal at their school was really pushing her around, saying, those girls don't respect you. What was the thing they were saying? Not they're laughing at you. They think everything's funny. And it's like, well, Angie, that's not a probation violation, thinking everything's funny. We can't fix that. What are you going to do to stop them from thinking everything's funny? So this graduated sanctions, now they're home with this bracelet on their leg. And that thing's monitored by?
BI.com.
Okay, by a company called BI.com. And they will notice us if they are out of range. We can pull them up at any time, see where they're at on their property. I can even tell when they leave for school tomorrow, which we hope they do, whether they use the front door of their house or the back door of their house. So it's a satellite operated machine that you can really tell things really close with it. So it's just one other level. I think both those girls go back to court in about a week, and we're going to give all these violations and all these problems to the judge, and the judge is going to make some decisions on whether they go with the father to Indiana, stay here with even tighter restrictions, or if they're ready for a group home with the state of Missouri. I don't really know what he's going to do. He has the big shoulders and the black robe, so he'll make the decision. So, which is kind of ironic because he is going to be leaving us soon. And I hear through the grapevine that we're might have a lady judge this next round, which my last female judge was Judge Muller,
Yes.
who I enjoyed completely. Yes. She was probably the roughest judge I've ever had.
Yes, she was.
So this could be interesting, another female judge. But anyhow, so the strategies change depending on what's going on with the kid.
Correct.
Now you've been here since, in this role in law enforcement for quite a few years. Are you working with any generational situations still? Second, third generation?
Well, like I said, I retired in April of last year. And prior to that, I got asked to join the the police department at our local college, which is Southeast Missouri State. We're police officers, but we're more just older generation school resource officers. We don't do a lot of what you would consider your typical law enforcement. Although I've worked here in the past few months, a lot of sexual assaults and stuff like that. But most of the time, it's you're dealing with older students, 17, 18, 19 years old, who are still adjusting to not having any parental guidance, who are still making their fair share of mistakes. So I think my experience as working here with Dr. Rhodes has been very beneficial, because I've learned how to deal with those older juveniles, and they're still juveniles. They still make mistakes. I didn't officially start the college till I was 46, and whereas I was very motivated. Anything less than an A I thought was a failure, and I would have some of my 17, 18, 19-year-old students just saying, God, if I can just get a C, or I could pass with a D, but if I can just get a C, I'll be ecstatic. And I just could not understand that.
Well, that's none of these guys.
No, I would know.
That's none of these guys at Ole Miss. I can tell you that right now. One of the things from Mike and I, between us, have almost 60 years of law enforcement. And it's scary to think about. But the rules, the policies, the philosophies have changed over all these years. And I'm sure he has them. I know I have them. I have these old cases that bother me now because of how I handled them back in the day. I've got one I wanted to share with him and share with you guys. And it came about the first year I started as a juvenile officer in 1986 in another county, another circuit, very rural circuit in mid-state Missouri. And this little girl was running away all the time, missing school. She was a truant. I worked with her between the ages of 14 and 16. And she lived with her grandfather and grandmother because her dad had warrants against him for just a bunch of white collar crime, but also I think some drug things. But anyhow, he was on the run. And so the little girl was placed with her grandfather and grandmother. Grandfather, they lived in a really nice house out on major highway going out of town, big brick house, lots of ground, lots of horses, and he was somehow connected with the county government. So he was connected, and he wanted something done with this girl. It was the same kind of thing like with these probationers. She thinks everything's funny. We need more control. You need to be doing more. He would call my boss and complain about I wasn't doing enough. I had her on probation. I felt like I was doing all I could. Well, over time, as she got closer to 17, which was our age out point, he was putting so much pressure on me and my boss that she ended up going to a detention center for almost 6 months. Now, think about it. This kid there was no law violations. It was just all runaway, truancy, not being home all night long, just all the stuff that we deal with now with counseling, social agencies, that kind of stuff. So I left that county at about the 3-year point. She aged out at 17, went to live with relatives in St. Louis. Well, a few years later, I heard from one of her relatives, now this was after the grandfather had died, that Shelley had confided to the family that grandfather was sexually abusing her. Okay? So we had provided counseling. I had spent numerous meetings with her. She was locked up in Hillsboro, Missouri. I wasn't going to say cities, but it was about an hour and a half from where my circuit county was. But I would drive up there because I felt bad even back then. Even though that was perfectly fine back then, you locked up status offenders. If they violated probation, that's what you did. So I'd drive up and talk to her. Anything you need, anything I could do for you. She always had a big smile on her face. Nothing. Nope. She was just shut mouth about what was going on in the family. And so now I think Miss Shelley's probably 38 years old. So this has been a long time ago, but that thing still haunts me. You know, that's one of those white whales or, you know, old cases that continually you're chasing in your head. And I think that's probably the biggest thing when I talk to other, I ran into Jimmy Smith the other day, and he immediately started talking about some cold case. I mean, obviously it's circling, still circling in that poor guy's brain, you know, about stuff that wasn't finished, stuff he didn't solve, and, you know, blaming other people for it not being solved and stuff. But that's an old detective we both know that's retired a few years ago. But anyhow, that kind of stuff hits you. If you guys, the ones that get in the field, maybe even some of you that go into the medical field and the schools, you'll probably have the same thing. So I'm forewarning you that the longer you stay in this stuff, the more those white whales are circling in your background, and they dredge up. You think about them. There's a few other cases that are a whole lot more severe than that one. A couple murder cases where I think guys got off on some domestic violence that turned out to be murders that they somehow got their kids involved in, or they're really horrendous cases. But those people are still walking the streets, nothing happened to them. And those are the kind that really kind of, on those death dates, when those deaths come around, they kind of haunt you. Because you remember, yeah, in May, that's when that happened. Or yeah, in March, that's when that death occurred. So those are things that kind of happen to us in the field, kind of stick in your head as stressor points. Speaking of stress points, one of the classes interviewed law enforcement officers about how they dealt with stress in the career. Mike, how did you do that, and how are you doing it now?
Overeating.
Over.
It's true. I was never one to drink or smoke, but like I said, a lot of times working rotating shift work, which is what we do now, and I'm restricted on how far away I can get from the campus to get a meal. And there's not very many health food stores right there. You got to settle for McDonald's or Burger King, or you got to learn to bring food to work, put it in the refrigerator, and cook. Uh, we're always 4 or 5 officers down, so you're always shorthanded. So, and then lunch breaks are pretty rare, so you've got to probably just run to McDonald's or run to someplace, wolf down a meal, and hopefully don't get a call while you're in the middle of a bite of food, something like that. But I mean, that's the norm. Uh, after 30 plus years, I've learned not to take work home and to leave home leave home and home and work at work. But like I said, there's still, like I said, Dr. Rose said, there's still some things that I still can't get off my mind, like certain instances or certain cases that I've worked that never got resolved the way I wanted to. And like I said, little things trigger that, and you think, wow, I could have done something different.
Yeah, I think that's everybody's story in law enforcement. So if you interview or talk to other officers, those are good questions to ask. To kind of, how do you deal with those, and what are your white whales? What are the things in the background that somebody has dealt with that they just kind of think about a lot? Um, there is a book called The Whites, which is a really good fiction book about a group of detectives that retire and then they go out and actually resolve those cases in illegal fashion. But the book is called The Whites. It's a really good novel, crime fiction novel. And all of those guys stole those files at the end of their career when they retired and took them home with them. So they had those old police files, so they had all that information. Um, I don't plan on doing that, but what I did do was I've copied a lot of stuff on a flash drive, so I'll be able to remember some old cases and names because I'm trying to write these, trying to keep everything anonymous, but I'm writing these things out because I think a lot of these stories shouldn't be lost. And I have some relatives that practiced law back 100 years ago, and I know absolutely nothing about their career. And I'm not going to let that happen to me. I'm really working to get, so far it's up to about 125 pages, but I'm looking to get a document together that'll be someplace. So if anybody's really interested in what a juvenile officer did and from 1990 or 1988 until 2021, well, that record's going to be kept because I've worked on that pretty hard and I'm going to have it finished by the end of the year. So we'll see how that goes. Any questions for either one of us? I wanted to show Mike something here before we let him roll. And like I said, this class was going to be only a half an hour, but I wanted him to look at this article. Mike does the training for our transporters and did transport training for the sheriff's department too. Do you know about this DYS case?
Vaguely, that's what caught my attention. I had heard a few things about it, but I didn't know the full story.
All right, let me share this with these guys. You guys should be able to see the screen now. If you put in your search engine DYS or DSS, juvenile jumped off Missouri River Bridge, you'll see a ton of articles from back 2010, I think, yeah, 2010 when this occurred. And this is a bridge we all drive over to get to our state capitol when we attend meetings and things. Well, this kid was in custody of Division of Youth Service Workers. That's almost like a juvenile officer, but they handle the residential side of things. And at this bridge, which I don't know, how high is that thing, Mike? 50, 60 feet? It's pretty high. And this was during flood conditions this year. He basically beat up those two workers while he was handcuffed and shackled. And then when they stopped the car on the bridge, he got out of the car and jumped off. And his body was never found. So every once in a while, this story pops up and some newspaper or TV station is doing some trying to get information out of the state about what happened. The state won't talk. The parents won't talk, which makes me think there was a settlement, probably a settlement with a non-disclosure clause put on it, but we don't know what happened. But it's one of those stories that really impress upon us when we're transporting kids how to prevent things like this, how to red flag them, how to know something. A kid might talk about something or not. You don't know about how they could act out on a transport. Mike, what do you do with this kind of situation or tell the officers to do when they're transporting kids?
Transport for law enforcement is one of the most dangerous things you can do. I don't want to second guess what they did, but with our training, we're taught that the child is first off he's searched, and then and then I teach how to properly attach restraints, and then also our vehicles are equipped with just like every vehicle is with child-proof. They can't be opened from the inside if the child-proof switch is hit. I can guarantee that probably was not done. And also,
there was no cage.
There was no cage either. We have cages in our vehicles. And then we have an officer that sits in the back with them. The driver, the other officer will sit behind him, and then the juvenile will sit to the right of them in restraints, and there's somebody back there with them at all times. I don't know exactly what the situation with them. I'm betting that both the officers were in the front seat, and that's how he was able to probably get his hands loose. We use a belt. Our handcuffs are attached to a leather belt that's put around the waist. I'm going to bet that this child was probably handcuffed in front, and he was able to put his handcuffs over the front of one of the officers and was probably choking him out. And like I said, when the other officer probably tried to help, he was able to assault him or her as well.
That'd be my guess too. And we've had kids slip them even before we had belts, handcuff them in the back, which is a horrible ride. You know, to have handcuffs in the back riding in a car. But we've had them get their hands down around their rear end and slip past their legs, and then they're free to fight. So transports are just a rough gig, any way you look at it. We are in Missouri, we're getting another year added to the juvenile age, which for philosophy and treatment purposes and brain science, it really makes sense. But for transportation issues and segregation issues of separating those older kids with the young kids, it's really going to cause a lot of problems with the juvenile justice system in the next few years until we get everything figured out. Because we'll be working with kids 17 and 18 years of age, and that's a different animal than a kid that's 12 and 13. You know, during the day this week, we had our 5th and 6th grade coding class in here, and those kids are barely 3 feet tall. You know, a 17, 18-year-old male, that could be a pretty big dude. So people are going to have to get used to being flexible and working with these different age kids. And it's like I said, it's a whole different mentality.
I remember the time you brought over Trayvon Moore. Trayvon Moore, he was 16 at the time that Dr. Rose brought him over to me at the county. Trayvon looked like Ray Lewis off the Baltimore Ravens and was probably just as mean. So he was a juvenile in age, but he was a man in stature.
Certified on some armed robbery or something. But yeah, I mean, at that age, your body can be fully mature. So it does make a big difference. And I'm worried about my officers, you know, how they're going to handle that, and how, you know, how it's going to be done without injury to people. So we'll see how that goes. Okay, if you go to your assignment page tonight, sometime this weekend before Sunday, here's the questions. They're there on the assignment pages, and they're about the live class tonight. Like I said, we'll have one more before the end of the class. For CJ 270, we might have 2, because I'm going to do one just for you regarding the grants, so you won't have any stress over doing that grant project. So that one will come up in about a week. Hopefully I'll get my voice a little better, because if I'm going to talk about grants for a half an hour, I want to not be this hoarse. So does anyone have any questions before I shut her down? Going once, going twice. No questions. All right, guys. Thank you very much. Hope you have a great week.
You too. Thank you.